The case for Syria now has been ongoing for what? It's been since 2011, so we're talking about 12, 13 years now.
Yes, the recent case, because obviously the whole authoritarianism in Syria started a long time ago, but yes, since the uprising began, since 2000.
We're talking about since 2011. This, as you put it, this is phase 2.
In a way, yeah.
If we're to assume that everything before was just one single phase.
Exactly.
And you have been hard at work pursuing the legal case. And during that time, we've heard so many things about the regime being presented to the ICC, about certain evidence being presented to. And, you know, when you hear these things, you can't help but hope for justice to come to the millions of victims in Syria. I mean, we're talking about, what, 50%, 60% of the Syrian population. We're talking nigh on 15 million between those killed, those wounded, some for life, and those displaced, whether internally or you know, as migrants. You know, the whole wave of migrants and the issue of refugees being addressed by the West entirely comes, with all due respect, from Syria.
Absolutely.
So, what am I justified in casting doubt over whatever legal attempts, whatever channels that you're pursuing, for instance, Ibrahim, that you're pursuing in order to bring the criminals to account in Syria?
I think you're absolutely justified. And so am I, before I have my coffee in the morning. I often feel like, is there a point? Is there a point from all of this? But then after I have my coffee, and I reflect a little bit, I get reassured by a number of factors. But let's, before I go into these factors, let's first set the scene a little bit. I don't think, you know, justice is something that is achievable, generally. Like if your, God forbid, son got hit by a car accident, by a drunk driver, what is justice? You know, even in the most stable, democratic, with all the kind of separation of powers, informed judiciary, people feel or get miscarriages of justice. We still hear them in the most advanced judicial systems, let alone in an authoritarian system, in a highly complicated proxy war with all sorts of crimes being committed in that sense. Absolutely. I don't think justice is the word. And so those of us who believe in divine justice, I personally do, and I think this is where, you know, I think in that sense. And so what is it then that we're working towards, if not justice? Or what sort of definition of justice, you know, would I adopt to be able to continue working for 12 years on, you know? And I started with this when I was very young. I was 18, 19, when I first started working on the legal work, setting up an NGO and then pushing and so on. And I think that the definition for, you know, of justice for me is more a process, not an outcome. It's the process of letting victims and survivors know that we haven't given up. It's the process of perpetrators knowing that we have not given up either, and that we're going to continue making their lives hell. If I'm unable to push forward a justice agenda, at least I will try my best and hardest to prevent an injustice agenda in that sense. So that process, because in a complicated conflict like that, I do not control the outcomes. You know, and I'm not responsible for the outcomes.
Let me ask you this. Okay, that sort of makes sense, but let me ask you this. When you meet a victim who has seen their family being killed by white phosphorus, by illegal chemical, biological weapons used by the regimes, displaced, deemed migrants forever probably, what do they ask you to do? What do they ask of you? What do you promise them?
I mean, first of all, I think different people have different kind of expectations, but I think, and they have different responses to that. But I think it, you know, says volumes that 12 years on, we had a criminal complaint found of chemical weapons by victims of chemical weapons who were subjected to all sorts of crimes, then chemical weapons, then displaced. I'm talking about Daghouta the Damascus
Yes.
area. And still, when they got to France, went to the judicial authorities and gave a complaint that led to France issuing an arrest warrant against Bashar al-Assad. In 2021, this was filed. The victims and the survivors of torture and the families of those who are still in regime cells or believed to be in regime cells, we don't know, assembled in October outside the International Court of Justice on the case that the Netherlands and Canada are taking against Syria before the International Court of Justice, something that I'm humbled to be assisting the Netherlands with. Assembled outside the court, flew from different parts of the world, holding pictures of their loved ones 12 years on. So for them, they see also that the process, like giving up, only fulfills the perpetrator. So they know it's not going to bring their children back. From the people that I speak to, they know it's not, no one is going to lock someone up and take them to court. Because again, the point is, if someone kills someone, domestic case, right? You get either a life sentence or a death penalty, depending where you are. If it's kind of intentional and all the elements are met. But what happens when someone kills 100,000? What is the criminological response of what sort of punishment can you give? So criminology itself is not advanced enough. Do you kill them 1,000 times?
Yeah.
Do you torture them? Of course not. Do you kill their family and parents? Of course not. Morally, religiously, culturally, legally, you're not allowed to do any of these things. So people know that. People know this. But this sense of fighting, of creating accountability, creating a consequence, is what seems to be mattering to a lot of people. And it might be a way of coping, that I'm still resisting. I'm still fighting. I'm still trying my best. The fact that when a regime tries to silence you, confronting the regime at the Security Council, speaking to them at the General Assembly, seeing them on trial, seeing all the diplomats sit on one side. I mean, this trial thing on the ICJ thing was surreal, just in a way to look at it. Seeing that for a regime that was trying to push being, even like not going to COP. The UAE invited Bashar al-Assad to go to COP, and he didn't go for a variety of reasons, and you'll never know. But for the first time,
was part of those reasons the fear of being arrested?
I mean, I think it's the
or was it
the burden,
the public face?
I mean, no, it's the burden. It will trigger a legal process. It may not. The UAE might be under pressure. I know for a fact governments have agreed not to be in the family photo in the UAE if Bashar al-Assad is there. Right. Businessmen, I heard when we were in Doha a few weeks ago, that a CEO of a very big international company who was invited to COP said, "I will not appear if Bashar al-Assad is there. It's bad for business." Wow. So when you hear these things, you still feel like going. Going back to the feelings I get after I have a coffee in the morning, there's another thing that keeps me going. It's because perpetrators care. If they did not care about the processes, if they did not cause a fuss about trying to disinform and attack the UN and attack the legal processes and try to sabotage court processes and all of that, maybe I should have a different fight. But they care. They respond. They hire the best lawyers. They try to use whatever. They're using the system. So if they're using the system, why should I not? Or why should I just keep failing at that system? System is broke, system is unfair, system doesn't deliver justice, system is double standards. Fine, but there is a standard. Even if double standards are applied. But then at least I can call them out as double standards because I have something to measure with. So it's a tool to push back. Perpetrators use it. They're very good at it. The question is, why are we not? And that's my mission. Yeah. To try and really have a Syrian voice working for Syria with experts, with people who care and so on, Syria and beyond. Because again, these standards, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, these norms, what we always tell the world is that this was never a message to us. We're the direct victims of that, fine. Direct consequence. But when the regime breaches a convention or a treaty, that's not a message to us. That's a message to the international community that I could, like the chemical weapons thing, I could join a chemical weapons convention treaty and then break it in that sense. So that's why the entire conversation about justice matters in that sense. And that's because perpetrators care, then at least I should. And that's what's personally sometimes driving me.
The fact that now the regime is being sort of normalized once again from the political perspective, whilst 10 years ago, for instance, the United States, issued very, quite strong statements regarding red lines and what have you. And there was condemnation from various corners, some seen as quite influential, quite powerful. But 10 years on, I mean, one could argue that, well, the regime won, because ultimately now, people who spoke angrily about the regime back then have scurried to Damascus to shake hands, to invite, for instance, to appear as though everything is fine once again. How does that, firstly, as a Syrian, how does that make you feel? Secondly, how does that impact the legal process that you're engaged with?
So I don't like to define what happens in complex conflict like that as winning and losing, because I don't know what winning means. I don't know what losing means in that sense. So that for me, I try to avoid that binary thinking, because there are way too many factors. Is the regime today the regime that it wasn't before 2011 in terms of the strength, control of the land? Of course not. International relations? Of course not. It used to have embassies all over the world. It used to, be a legitimate regime in the eyes of the international community. Europe was establishing bilateral lines and economic lines. Syrians were afraid to speak. No one was able to express dissent. It controlled 100% of the land. None of that is existent today. Iran and Russia are incredibly powerful in Syria and regime-controlled areas. There are areas that the regime cannot enter, that including are, in theory, under its control, like the south of Syria. The north of Syria is not under its control. The northeast is not under its control, physically, militarily, all of that. And so it's hard for me to identify what's winning and losing in that sense. But in terms of the kind of normalization things, it shows me a couple of things. One, that policies change. If they can change one way, they can change the other way, right? So the fact that, yes, 10 years ago that they were that and then changed does not mean that they cannot change again. So it means things shift in that sense. I think that's a good reminder, because everyone views countries and states as one policy, one government, one current, that there's nothing we can do. We can do. Things do change. And, changing in the Gulf, it's still the same people. So the foreign ministers largely are the same. The heads of state are largely the same. It's the same policy. These things don't change there in that sense. Yet it's the same people, but the policy has been changing, which, as an Arab, is a hard thing to do usually, to go back on who you were, on your word. So then this takes us to the next point. So why is this happening, or why are the attempts of these happening? So for us, or for me, I don't see it as they want to get back with their best friend that they couldn't get to because of America says no. It's not a normalization because we're allies or we're friends or we're besties in that sense. It's more of, I have interests now that I might be able to kind of get something out of it. The regime becoming a narco state, exporting Captagon to the entirety of the region, is a huge threat in that sense. The Jordanians thought that they could do that with normalization. Just 2 days ago, they sent warplanes into Syria.
Yeah.
They can see that. The whole Iranian influence saying, okay, we're going to counter Iranian influence by trying to get Damascus back. Clearly hasn't worked. But you know what has happened? If you'd asked me this question in June or end of May, when the regime was got back to the Arab League, I would have been worried. Today, I'm not. Because even the Arab countries see that they have nothing to offer. Fine. You want to experiment? Go ahead. In that sense. So as a Syrian, yes, it creates a bit of a bitterness, but it is also something that encourages you to push harder, push further in that sense. How does it impact my work in terms of international justice and law? I think it does a little bit. But again, none of the funding used to come for human rights from the Gulf areas. None of the kind of resolutions sponsored, except from Qatar. Qatar used to be the one, sponsoring resolutions for international justice when it comes to Syria, but others didn't. So that was not missed in that sense. Do the bilateral relations, or do the relationships between, for example, say the United Kingdom, US, or France matter more, for example, to a country like the UAE than its relationship with Syria? I mean, is the UAE willing to risk or put so much political weight to save the regime in comparison to its relationship with the West? I haven't seen that, come to bear. So unfortunately, it's a reflection on them. Right. On the normalizers, rather than an actual impact. I mean, look, the ICJ case, Netherlands and Canada, it started them knowing that normalization things are happening. The arrest warrants coming out from France, is happening. These things happen after normalization.
Tell me what is happening.
So there's a lot. I mean, unfortunately, because of the complex nature of the conflict and the number of actors involved, I don't think we're going to get a Syria court. Because you have the coalition that's anti-ISIS, that's 53 countries. You have the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, financing, supporting, fighting. Everyone kind of committed at least abuses on different scales in that sense. So from a political will perspective, I highly doubt we're going to have something similar like to the Rwanda courts or the Yugoslavia courts or something along these lines. So what we have is bits and pieces, right? Coming together in different ways. And so this might sound a bit counterintuitive as a lawyer, as a barrister even, that I don't see justice as just judicial. I just see the process, wherever it is. So fact-finding, when you're trying to hide the facts, is a form of accountability.
Right.
In that sense. When you're trying to appear as the legitimate state, and that's taken away from you or challenged, that's a form of accountability. When you're trying to grow an illicit economy and that's being fought economically through economic means, that's a form of accountability, right? So all of that is happening. But from a justice perspective, the biggest thing at the moment is, some of the biggest things is you have the Netherlands and Canada are taking Syria to the International Court of Justice, or have taken Syria to the International Court of Justice over breaches of the Torture Convention. And they have listed everything documented: torture, sexual violence as torture, even chemical weapons as torture, detention, forced disappearance, everything as torture. So this is now at the moment a historic case that's kind of ongoing. Okay. And we had the first order from the court come out in November, kind of acknowledging the evidence and saying Syria, until I look into this, Syria must stop all the torture that's committing and so on. So that's the first point. Then there are some domestic universal jurisdiction cases. So these are when domestic courts use their courts to prosecute crimes
brought by citizens of those countries who are victims of
Syrians, usually dual citizens or people who arrived and so on. And that again sends you a message that they could have just claimed asylum, started a new life,
and just moved on.
So forget. I think khalas is an international word. Word
everyone uses khalas now.
Everyone knows khalas, inshallah, and so on. So, and that's it. But they're still fighting. Notwithstanding that they have families in Damascus and intimidation happens. I mean, an upcoming report will probably show now how intimidation is happening to these witnesses. They know that. They're still going. Still pushing. So we had a couple of cases in Germany. Now the most recent thing is the French case, the French arrest warrants, which included the president, his brother, and two others. When it comes to the
by the way, just on a technical level, why didn't it take into consideration the immunity of the head of state?
It did, and now that's the battle against the French in their own courts. So in the French system, the judges can issue the arrest warrants, and then it goes to the prosecutor of France to then confirm them.
Right.
So the prosecutor has come back and says, I don't know, on the immunities question.
Okay.
So now a battle will emerge.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And people will push, and the point is here, at least, that the judges that look at the evidence, the point is that judges looked at the evidence, they looked at the victims. They attributed the evidence. They had enough sufficient thing to go up to the head of state, because chemical weapons is not the wrong missile projectile that you put on a plane. There's
something deliberate where there's a process.
There's a process. You don't do, and even if you do not know in 2013 when the first chemical attacks happened, then you should have at least had processes for preventing subsequent use. So all of that is in place. Okay, immunity is a technical issue. It's not on substance, right? And I would consider it a big success that already now, if you Google Bashar al-Assad with nothing else, put it on Google and put news. All you get is arrest warrant, arrest warrant, arrest warrant, arrest warrant. Even if it fails on a technicality, even if that happens, then what does it say about Bashar al-Assad? He's hiding behind his immunities can be waived, by the way. He can go and say,
I have nothing to hide.
I have nothing to hide. I will challenge this. I will appoint lawyers. I will present the evidence. None of that. So the field that I'm in is strategic litigation, because litigation we cannot get justice to so many numbers and so on. So this strategic litigation involves multiple issues in that sense. But keeping Syria at the agenda of the Security Council, which it is, I think now 2 or 3 times a month, right? They're meeting on Syria. Having an international organization, the first of its kind, Africa. There's 2 international organizations that were created for the first of its kind historically. One is a semi-prosecutorial UN mechanism that doesn't just document, but also does not wait for a court. It's prosecutors building cases for when there are courts. It's an in-between. This was never created before, in that sense, called the IIIM. And now there's an institute for the missing. So the fact that there are blockages and the Institute for the Missing was pushed by victims. Honestly, Dr. Anas, the fact that they went to New York and capitals, Global South, Global North, and they got, I don't know how many, 90 plus votes. It's incredible. It's the mothers, the fathers, and all of that. And so the point that I'm making is that as long as they're Syrians and allies who care about these things or continue to push, I honestly have nothing to fear.
It's, I mean, the way you frame it is, it makes it clear that this is a worthy effort. I recall a number of years ago, there was something that caught the headlines called the Caesar law. And that was seen as quite a blow to the regime and quite a win for the victims. Tell me a little bit about that, about the technicalities particularly. I mean, what kind of implications does, for instance, the Caesar law have on the victims for Syria?
So, just as for context, so Caesar is a guy who used to be a military photographer within the regime, and he defected after filming all these horrific photos of what's going on in torture chambers, and all these films and people with skeletons who look skeletons. He's the one who I think released 55,000 photos, and families at that time were looking through the photos and recognized a lot of them, and then now. A key advocacy group called the Caesar Family Association. So people who've identified their loved ones in the Caesar photos have now formed a group that actually pushed for this creation of the mechanism of the thing. So just to show you how things progress, in that sense. So Caesar was a big change in the Syrian context because it's a defector. The photographs were authenticated. They were used in different court processes. They were put before Congress, put before Parliament, and so on. But then the issue was always what is next and what can happen and so on. And the issue of Caesar kind of went back a little bit because other crimes came to the forefront and so on. There's a very strong Syrian American lobby group in the US, and they push for all sorts of accountability policies and so on. And so during the Trump era, even a little bit before, they started working on what is the US willing to do? And what can be done. And obviously it's a military power, but it's also an economic power. And so they pushed for sanctions through something called the Caesar law that makes it very hard. And they pushed through Congress. That's the difference. It's not an executive order without going to the details, which makes it hard from one president to the other to change it. Yeah. And that's it. It's a bipartisan bill that passed God knows how many readings in both the House and the Senate and so on through Congress. So Caesar, what it does, one of the things it does, it creates secondary sanctions, which means if you do not do anything but interact with a sanctioned person, i.e. the regime, who has done the horrible things, you open yourself to potential liability, right? So that's one of the things it does. And so that created fear for normalization. Yeah. And that's why you hear the regime talking about Caesar, you hear some of the Gulf states talking about Caesar and so on, but that's not something that Biden can remove. In that sense. So it created that effect. But that sanctions is never just it shouldn't be a policy. It's a policy tool. Yeah. But at the time where there is no policy, we need to use
it's the only thing you have.
It's the only thing we have. But on its own, it's not enough. And it can actually cause effects that are we don't want ordinary Syrians to suffer or be impacted by sanctions and so on, which the regime is using as human shields when it comes to these issues. So it's a very tricky debate. But Caesar was one of the successes in kind of a point in pushing this matter forward, because what it also did is that for regime supporters, like what is the Caesar law? And just the name, it was actually funny. Funny is the wrong word, but they were one of the kind of regime propagandists who clearly seems to be affected by brainwashing as well. Like they don't watch other news, and they're like, we were affected by the Caesar law. So I went to Googled who Caesar was, and oh my God, and he was actually surprised that there are these photos coming from regime cells, and he started saying, Allah, may God have mercy on them, and so the name Caesar itself triggered people who are pro-regime, who are affected by the Syria sanctions, and their allies to look up who Caesar was. In that, and for us, he's a hero, absolutely.
Okay, when at the very start, you made a very sort of strong interjection that Syria didn't start in 2011. The Syrian tragedy has been long ongoing. And I don't know whether you wish to trace it all the way back to the late 60s with the arrival of Hafez al-Assad, 1980, 81, with the Hama massacre. Thereafter, I mean, how far back do you go?
I mean, it's obviously very hard to kind of know when injustices start, because obviously Syria was also a colony, and and there was a lot of things there, and so on. Before I answer this question, one of the things that really gets to I became hardened to a lot of things over the last 12 years. One thing that I'm not hardened, or haven't become hardened to, is having one of these conversations, this very basic, shallow conversation. And they're like, oh, so where are you from? And I say, Syria. It's like, oh, it used to be a beautiful country, right? And that word really gets to me. Because it means, yes, for tourism, they would go and see the beauty of the country, absolutely. But they would imply that people who rose up for basic rights, first of all, they wouldn't see what used to happen in the dungeons below their touristic areas, and the people who could not return and the forced experience. And Syria was a democracy, and he was elected. And so although the constitution, as you know, was changed in order to make the son the president and so on. And that puts me in a situation where I actually don't know how to, still 12 years on, how to respond.
You have to dispute that it was a beautiful country.
On the outside, it is beautiful, absolutely, but that's... But then why would people cause an uprising?
Uprise? Is it because they don't want their country to be
beautiful? Exactly. You know what I mean? So it's still one of the most difficult things to know. Do you dispute that your country was beautiful from the outside, but not from the inside? And anyway, so I mean, I would trace it back at least to the recent, more authoritarian. So the arrival of Hafez al-Assad, and then the way he kind of consolidated power, and then obviously passed on power to his son. And as you know, when his son came, a lot of people was like, "Oh, British educated, there is a chance."
And a doctor, no less.
Absolutely, and you're married to a British lady and or Syrian British lady, and whose father is also a doctor, and all of that. People expected some sort of change. And nothing came. Nothing came in the early 2000s, and so on. And that's why people took it to the streets and so on. But again, it's a constant battle. I think the battle between evil and good.
Yeah,
I can't put a date on it.
Yeah,
it's always been an ongoing thing, and I don't. And that's why I said I don't know what winning and losing is, or I don't know what winning. I don't want to know what winning and losing is. I don't want to know how justice is defined. I'd like to have this very, very subjective definition that fits me to continue fighting, and fits others to rally together.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I'm not interested in any textbook definitions of anything, because it will make me tired. It will make me stop. It will make people feel, okay, what's the point? It's been going on for 30 years, 40 years. What's the point? And injustices usually last because people give up. These are the only ones that people kind of, the perpetrators are the only one that benefit from us not having a coping mechanism of definitions. I know I might sound like a crazy person to you and the audience, but that's honestly how
Well, I have to say that I identify with a lot of what you're saying. I mean, I myself come from Iraq, and those awkward conversations that I have on all sides, by the way, not just by foreigners, talking about the cradle of civilizations and the such, but also, I mean, more recently about people praising and saying, well, you had it so good during the days of Saddam, you're so brave, and then you're stuck. I mean, what do you say? Where do you go? But the fact of the matter is that you realize that people are comparing the here and now, and that is part of the problem. Not only, this is not a small scale thing; it's a global thing, and that is our memory in regards with history is extremely short term.
Absolutely, the history point is the key point. People don't often read history or read history from one perspective, and then that often sometimes because no one wants to write about their failures. So when you read about the golden eras of the Arab world or the Ottoman Empire or the Islamic civilization, people fought all the time.
Yeah.
All the time there were scandals and fighting. And so there were successes on some points and failures just as many other. And so reading about presenting anything as a golden era.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, fine. In some perspective, yes. But presenting it in a way that then makes us feel like we're absolutely failing.
Yeah.
Or absolutely, statistically, Dr. Anas, it actually feels bad to say this because humans are not statistics, but statistically, there are less people dying now.
Yeah.
Even in wars. Yeah. When you hear about the Mongols or Baghdad, like you give an example on how does a river turn blue or red? How many people must you put in that river, in order for it to change color, but because of the amount of death or the amount of ink of, you know what I mean? Like, so millions have been killed, but we just know about it more now. So does that mean we're failing or no? I don't know. And honestly, don't care. As long as I'm pushing and as long as I have a support system around me that holds me in check, because you can easily then think you're doing good and you're actually doing harm. And that I think is the worst thing in at least my line of work that you could be doing. So you need to hold yourself in check and question your intentions as to why you're doing. Because again, the side that we didn't talk about is, when I go to the law events and they're like, oh, you made an amazing career. You're 30. How do you do this with governments? And I usually make it very awkward for them, unfortunately. But it's quite funny. And I say, I just wished, because I know they mean it nicely, but I say, I wish I didn't have a war in my country or something like that. And then they panic because they didn't mean it that way. But obviously you need to hold yourself in check. Because there's a lot of people that make only career progressions because I'm a professional. I have a term, the word career applies to what I'm doing. But if you're only having that, and that's what you're pushing you through, that's also something that you need to be kind of hold in check in that, or the financial gains or whatever it is. So as long as I have the system around me, the support system that kind of holds you in check, then you should continue the fight.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. And this brings me to something which I have to say it pains me a little. And that is that regardless or despite the horrific nature of Syria over the course of the past 12 years, it's now become sort of a side issue, a secondary issue. It's something that people just mention in passing rather than, even those that were absolutely with the revolution, with democratic change, with freedom for the Syrian people. It's now it's taken a back row, if you wish. And particularly now that we are in the midst of the Gaza massacre. And that must be extremely frustrating. I mean, I have to say, again, bringing it back to Iraq. 20 years ago, all that the world talked about was Iraq. Whether it be the opposition to the war, whether it be the illegality or otherwise of the Bush-Blair venture in Iraq, whether it be the occupation, whether it be the fallout, sectarian politics, and the kind of mass killings and the such, maybe exceeding the 1.5 million mark, no one knows. But then we all went back to what we were doing. And now when you mention Iraq, people, it's as though it's something we did. Khalas, let's just put it in the back burner. It's something we spent time, we demonstrated on, we protested, we sent letters to our MPs. But now we're moving on. It's as though we are constantly trying to catch up with tragedies, with horrific stories. And Syria is one of those. I'm following the news, and whilst absolutely the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, but at the same time, I hear about this massive strike on Idlib by the regime that claims the lives of, hundreds of civilians in one strike. But there's no one's talking about it.
Yeah, I think that's human nature. Right. It's something that I kind of even studied at Oxford last year, 2 years ago, is that people can't relate to mass things. People cannot relate to parallel things. They need one child, one human that they can identify with. People need to identify to things that they can see and people or feel, and people want to be able to feel like they do something. So if we think about, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Myanmar, there's so much going on in the world, so much injustice going on. Sometimes bigger scale, sometimes lesser scale, sometimes by more democratic countries, and others are kind of more authoritarian. And so I think it's also a way of people being able to survive. So I don't blame people with having the fatigue. I honestly don't. I used to be very angry. I was like, why don't you care? What used to happen? I used to live in this parallel world, as you know, Dr. Anas. I used to go down to Syria during the conflict very actively. And then 4 hours later, I'm back in London. And then I'm, sitting in whichever cafe. And it's like, why don't these people care about what I just saw 4 hours ago? Yeah. You know what I mean? In that sense. But I realized two things. One, it's our responsibility to keep the headlines. Right? It's the responsibility of those who carry the cause to keep
you
fighting.
You can't expect victims to continue to push the headline.
I mean, it's hard, but it's the Syrians, it's the people who work on those issues to keep fighting. I don't expect the editor of the BBC to wake up in the morning and say, I care about Syria today. And if they do, that's great. But if they don't, it's a matter to be able to for us to push. And the other thing is that I don't blame people. Right, so these are the kind of two things. But again, living in my kind of world of what winning and losing means, I honestly felt at some point that Russia, which backed the Assad regime, felt so empowered that all the attention was on Syria because it could block things. Now that it's off the radar, it's not getting economic gains. It's not moving anywhere. They're struggling. So is the regime. Like it's their limelight sometimes gives you more leverage in that sense. So is no limelight something that's necessarily bad? As long as they're actors who are working, sometimes yes, with policymakers, it's hard to push certain things when you're unable to. But the regime is very good at bringing attention back to Syria. Things calm down, boom, chemical weapons. Things calm down, boom, refugee crisis. Things calm down, Captagon. I mean, this podcast that I one of the podcasts I listened to, the rest is politics. They mentioned Captagon in Syria. I was like, for a UK audience, I was like, wow, congratulations, Bashar, you made it to the headlines again. Like because that's when you try to ignore a conflict like this, it spills over.
But you have to think to yourself. I mean, is it pure stupidity or is it something deliberate? Maybe
it's survival. They needed the cash. They needed the income. The drug thing. I mean,
no, but these, for instance, like you said, I mean, every time Syria disappears from the headlines, they manage somehow to haul the news back to what's happening in Syria through committing a crime or bombing something or.
I mean, it's a mix of things. I mean, chemical weapons, I think because people, when there was a big chemical weapons conference that we were at in November, and people were like, chemical weapons were banned, okay, because they're bad, but they're also not very effective. Like, for the kind of wars that were fought in Europe, yes. But when you're trying to get people to surrender, chemical weapons and a lack of reaction from the international community to the use of chemical weapons are very effective, because the people are like, if they're not going to respond to chemical weapons, I may just leave. Why should I hold on to my to where I am? Particularly because you can't hide in the bunkers if there were any, because they go down, and you go up, you get barrel bombs. So you know what I mean. So sometimes it was a military need, sometimes it was a political need. Sometimes it's an economic need. Like now the issue with drugs, and sometimes you're out of control. Like you can't control so many different things. So I wouldn't do it as stupidity, but it's just a matter of it's a hard narrative to control. But these things always come back. I mean, Iraq came back when the whole Syria strike came back, right? And so these things never go away in that sense. But as long as that fact that something is not in the limelight does not make the actors that are pushing for it or the actors that care for it give up, news.
The Russia part is interesting. I mean, obviously, since Russia became part of the bad books of the world 2 years ago, surely Syria must have, once again, found some breathing space. And I talk Syria about the revolution, the freedom fighters and the such. Surely, I mean, they must have found some new spaces that weren't there before.
I mean, it's funny because a lot of Syrians would have said, said that something global needs to happen in order for something to move in Syria. Ukraine happened, right? It doesn't get more global than that at the moment. So a couple of things happened. But again, this shows you that, Syria is now a very proxy war. And the allies that, the opposition have are also not necessarily your allies when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, right? So you're not mentioning names, but you have countries that are not necessarily against Russia in Ukraine, right? Or don't want to link the files. Because this idea, as you know very well, the foreign offices are usually structured geographically, not thematically, right? So it's not have the war department. You have the Syria department, down the hall you have the Ukraine department, and down the hall you have the Russia department. And linking them makes things very, very complex. So while because I have to agree, like such was the case with Russia, I have to agree a resolution in the Security Council with Russia. The US has to do that. When it comes to Syria, it's not going to agree with that on Ukraine, and so they're not necessarily wanting to link both. But it did open up a space, and one interesting space was the narrative. President Zelensky kept always reminding the world that Russia felt emboldened by what happened, by the impunity it had in Syria. I led a Syrian delegation in August to Ukraine to show solidarity and to link. And that was an opening, for example. And they hosted us with official protocol police cars and vans because they wanted to also annoy the Russians. So these are the Syrians we recognize in that. By the way, although Syria officially is an unfriendly country to Ukraine, which means you don't even get visas. It was a horrific situation to identify what kind of Syrian are you. And it was actually quite sad that a lot of the Ukrainians we met, we had to explain to them which Syrians we are, because it's like, a North Korean coming or an Iranian coming to different parts of Syria, you immediately think they're on the opposing side until you figure out who they are. But that kind of provided an opportunity to show the world what Russia did in Syria and opened up political. So a lot of countries that were afraid of accountability on Syria because of what Russia might react are no longer afraid now. For example, right? A lot of fears about, but Assad, head of state, they're going after Putin. Yeah. You know what I mean? So now it allows us to say, well, much smaller fish, buddy. Like if you manage to do that against Putin, you should be able to do that against other perpetrators in that. And so it opened up that space. Not every country wanted to link because admitting defeat in Syria is hard for Western countries in that sense, or for administration. So that was a bit hard. But the UK, for example, was very happy to link, and they made, I appeared in a Foreign Office video saying, we feel for what the Ukrainians are going through because of what we've seen in Syria, and we sense a full sense of solidarity. And these were heartfelt words. What Russia is doing in Ukraine illegally, the aggression thing, it did in Syria legally. It prompted up a regime that starts self-determination in that sense.
Let me tell you about something that is extremely difficult, which I, myself, my organization, my supporters have to deal with, and it's extremely difficult. And I'm pretty sure you know what I'm going to talk about.
And I'm worried about it. I have no idea, but knowing you, if you're having difficulties.
Well, the thing is that right now, obviously, we are in the throes of one of the greatest popular movements around the world in support of Gaza and in condemnation of Israeli crimes against the people, the civilians of Gaza. And it promises to be, one of the biggest manifestations of global opposition, and probably leading to radical change on various levels. Political is one of them, but also on many, many, many other levels.
Absolutely.
But the thing is that I realize that many of those whom with I am marching and I am chanting and we agree.
I know where you're going.
Are people who find that Bashar al-Assad is the legitimate and rightful and just and worthy leader and president of Syria. And they see the revolution, which I unconditionally, unequivocally support, as being an American empirical sort of project to destabilize Syria and to scupper the riches and the incredible, potentials of Syria. Where do you go? What do you do?
It's very disheartening, honestly, and it's very hard that we often accuse countries of double standards, but when you look at such individuals, they're applying the same double standard. They're not happy to call out a war crime or a crime against humanity in one side because they're potentially their allies, but they're happy to do it rightly when it's the other side or the enemy in that sense. So I think sometimes we have to look inwards, and I'd remind them all to look inwards and they apply the single standard when they're calling out others on double standards. As you know, I'm involved a lot in policy, and to make the conversation harder, some of your allies, country allies on Syria who are standing up against the regime are not the ones doing so when it comes to the same crimes that you're dealing with in Gaza in that sense. And I have to interact with those governments. And they're good people. And they're the right policies on Syria. The not so wrong right ones on Gaza.
What do you do? Compartmentalize? What do you do? Isolate? What do you do?
I always think about how do governments do it? When two countries' presidents meet, they have trouble on the economy, fights on fish, war, turfs. They have alignment on immigration. They differ on this, but they still manage to do the compartments in order to move things forward. And I think there's no right and wrong approach with these things. There are people who should be loud against everything and standing up against everything and so on. But there should be people who should really bite the bullet, for lack of a better metaphor in this context, and be happy to engage on some issues quietly, on others publicly, and deal with the issues where they can add the most value in the most effective way.
But you do realize that, for instance, me standing next to someone on Palestine so beautifully, but they are more than happy to come out and defend the regime and to accuse the victims in Syria of feigning injury because of, alleged, as they call it, barrel bombs or white phosphorus or whatever illegal weapons. How will that impact a victim who's watching?
My question is that how would that impact the cause they're advocating for? Because their credibility, it's the same people that doubted Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the UN on Syria are the ones sharing Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and UN reports on Palestine in this. Would I personally pick them up as an ally? No. In that sense, fine. If everyone chooses the causes they support and the causes that they oppose. But if I would be in a different forum, I'd definitely grill them on whatever they're not standing, as I'm sure you would. And when it comes to Syria, I think picking battles is hard. I think prioritizing is hard. And I think this is kind of a hallmark of our era. There's so many causes. Previously I would assume you're from that geographical area, or your father was from that geographical, and you're just focused on that area. This is what you know. This is where you have information. But because now we know so much, and there's so much disinformation as well, we feel like we have to respond to all causes in the same way and so on. I think we need to appreciate, so if I control the platform, I wouldn't platform such people. I wouldn't choose them as my allies. If they happen to be there, they happen to be there. I wouldn't necessarily co-sign and do all of things with them. Obviously, I differentiate them between those who are quiet on Syria. In the same way that I would excuse some of the people who are quiet on the issue of Palestine, because they know that not all wars and injustices are fought publicly in that sense. And that's where we have to be kind of selective in how we do things and which leverage do I lose in order to gain what. Because I feel sometimes being public is about you relieving, depending on who you are, obviously, but it's sometimes about relieving our conscience. It's about me feeling that I've expressed something, which is fine. But that's where we need to kind of be careful on those issues. But I wouldn't necessarily platform them or work closely with them and so on.
You remind me of a conversation I had recently. I'm also a promoter of the rights of the Uyghurs in China. And again, to my horror, I was one of the earlier people to come in contact with the Uyghurs. And when I heard about, it was the first time I heard about this, is around 2010. And a lot of people didn't even know that there was the case of East Turkestan and the like. And then to my horror, I find out that there is a sizable community, Muslim, as well as human rights fighting and, pioneering the such, who think of the Uyghur cause as an American plot to undermine the Chinese regime, and therefore they've plotted these people, and these people have no case whatsoever. And therefore, it's similar to what to the Syrian case. But then you find to your horror that your friends, the Uyghurs, are in touch with the Israelis. Yeah. Because the Israelis have spoken publicly about the horrors committed by the Chinese regime against the Uyghurs, and all of a sudden you are in this incredibly tangled web where you have to navigate. And the thing is, okay, so I tell the Uyghurs, listen, this is not good for you, this doesn't work, this is against, your very standing and your very principles as people of a just cause. But then they tell you, listen, what is that we can do? We need access. We need to get to the UN. We need to get to places of power in Washington and Paris and the like. And this is something we have to do. And you just stay quiet. What do you do?
I think, and look at, for example, in the early days about how Zelensky, for example, came out in more support of Israel's policies. Yeah. Than the Israelis themselves, to be honest. Like the President Zelensky, and now he toned it down. I think his advisors spoke to him and said, okay, now he's talking about calm in the Middle East and so on. But Ukraine is one of my biggest allies on Syria. Mm. I just met the guy a few weeks before.
Yeah, shame on you.
It's like, but the point that's the point. I think we need to really, as countries see it in the same way, look at interests. Mm. Right? It's intersection of interest. And it's not interest in a bad sense of the word. Yes, you and I are allies on this cause, just right cause. You and I are enemies on a different thing. Yeah, and we don't agree. We don't see eye to eye. I wouldn't invite you to dinner. If that's the metric. Yes, and that should be okay. And it's hard because it's not for me the person. A person is my wife. I don't look at policies and intersection of interests with my wife. She's a person that I would like to be with because she's the person. My kids, my friends. Mm. People I interact with for causes that they care about and that I care about, I think should be absolutely fine to have intersecting interests, but not on everything. Yeah. And that doesn't mean I have to attack them on everything, nor do they have to attack me on everything. But that doesn't mean I have to like them or they like me. It's not about liking the person. We love to idealize people. We love to think of countries as one voice, one position, and so on. But as you know, they're not. And so it's about moving things. And that's very hard.
You remind me of when I was much younger. And I was coming to learn.
Don't make yourself too old.
I believe you me, I wish. And I was coming to learn, about politics, and I remember being given one of my most valuable lessons, which now I impart on, younger people who are now entering the world of politics. It was a discussion that I had with, as a junior researcher, with someone from the State Department in Washington. And I asked them particularly about their relationship with Iran. And at the time, what he said was enlightening. He said, listen, between us and Iran, there are 22 issues. 22 issues, specifically. On 15, we absolutely disagree. To the point of almost going to war. And then there are 7 other cases on which we agree. In some cases where we absolutely collaborate, where we absolutely work together, where we absolutely coordinate and the such. And in those words, I was given a lesson as to how not only global politics works, but how human interaction happens and how we can work for causes with people, the same people with whom we absolutely disagree on other causes. It takes a level of, I would suggest, a level of political maturity that, to be honest, is a very, very scarce currency these days. Because, people work on the basis of love-hate, that
It's maturity, but also I think it requires you to be constantly uncomfortable with yourself.
Uncomfortable.
Because you're constantly, because it's not, I don't think it's human nature. I think what you're describing is absolutely correct. I don't think it's human nature. I think it's not a comfortable feeling to meet someone on something and then oppose them and be on the opposite side with the same person. Because we we're humans. We like relationships. Yeah. I'd like to like the person and so on. So I think it's much harder, emotionally harder, from a characteristic perspective harder to ask what you do, to do what you're asking people to do. And it's a slippery slope, because then that transactional way of dealing and interest and so on can then become extreme, where you no longer know your friends are and your enemies are and so on. People will, because there are characteristics like loyalty that gets questioned, characteristics like truth, like turning your back, like changing things, like hypocrisy. All of these are put on the line if you don't know how to manage them carefully. And people will have both perceptions of you. Some people will see you as an incredible pragmatist who's able to push a cause. Others will see you as a person with double standards. Some will see you as, a person who is disloyal, and others, I don't know, will see you as someone who is vague and you don't know what their positions are. And if you're, it's not from a scientific perspective, a situation of calm or balance, or I don't know I forgot what the atomic
comfort zone. You're not in your comfort zone.
You're not in your comfort zone. And it's not fair to ask a lot of people to do this. But if you want to have the impact in politics, that's what you have to do. Yeah. That is what you have to do. And the worst thing, Dr. Anas, is that you start getting attacked by your own allies, by your own friends. Yeah. Why don't you have a position on this? Why do you have a position on this or not? Why are you louder on this and not on that? Yeah. You know what I mean? And they're right publicly. Yeah. But it's very hard.
It is.
It is very hard, but it's impactful.
Allah يجزيك الخير.
وإياكم.
ما شاء الله عليك. أحسنت.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciated.
How did you find that?
Amazing.